Morning, boys. Coffee's ready.
You call that coffee? Smells like burnt socks. Sure, gringo. Let's see you hit something other than your own boots. Finish your bread before running off. Finish your bread before running off.
What do you want?
I came to talk.
I've always been known for my aim, but tonight, I'm gonna shoot for truth.
Get help! Easy, girl, hold on! We need axes. Get axes!
Do you think I'm worth saving? The shaking gunslinger asked the Lakota woman. The glass orb exploded into a shower of crimson feathers 40 feet from where it should have. 20,000 eyes watched as Jackson's steady hand Morrow, the man who once shot the ash from Wild Bill's cigar, at 30 paces missed his 5th shot in a row. The autumn wind carried the jeers across the exhibition grounds like a plague. Someone threw a hat. Then another. Jack's hands trembled as he lowered the shotgun. Not the slight quiver of age that most 65-year-old men learn to hide, but a violent shake that rattled up from his wrists like a trapped bird trying to escape its cage. His Cherokee thoroughbred, painted white for the show, sensed his distress and shifted beneath him. Even the horse knew. From the announcer's platform, he heard the ringmaster's voice crack with forced enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give our living legend one more chance." But Jack could hear what lay beneath those words, the desperate calculation of a businessman watching his investment crumble. He had been someone once. God, he had been someone. The memories came unbidden that afternoon in Abilene, when he'd shot a silver dollar from between the fingers of a drunk who'd called him a fraud. The morning he'd put 6 rounds through a playing card as it tumbled through the air, each bullet finding its mark before the card touched earth. The night he'd saved a sheriff's life by shooting the pistol from an outlaw's hand in near total darkness, guided only by the glint of moonlight on steel. They called him Steady Hand then. The newspapers wrote that his nerves were made of iron, that he could thread a needle with a bullet at 20 yards. A senator once offered him $1,000 just to teach his son to shoot. He'd turned it down. He was too busy being a legend. Now at 65, his body had betrayed him. The tremor had started 6 months ago, subtle at first. A coffee cup that rattled against its saucer. A signature that looked like it belonged to someone else. Then it grew worse. Some days his right hand shook so badly he couldn't button his own shirt. On good days he could almost pass for normal, if normal meant being half the man he used to be. The crowd's patience was gone. Jack squeezed his eyes shut and raised the shotgun one more time. He aimed for the next glass orb, already airborne, spiraling against the darkening Kansas sky. His finger found the trigger. Steady, he told himself. Like you've done 10,000 times before. But the shot went wide again. The orb landed intact in the dirt, rolling mockingly toward the audience barrier. The arena erupted in boos. Not the playful jeering of a disappointed crowd, but something uglier, the sound of people who felt cheated, who'd paid good money to see a myth and found only a broken old man. Jack wheeled his horse around for the closing bow, the movement so practiced he could have done it in his sleep. That's when it happened. The wind, that treacherous prairie wind that had witnessed 100 performances, caught the edge of his hairpiece. The chestnut wig that transformed his bald scalp into the flowing locks of a frontier hero lifted like a bird taking flight. For one suspended moment it hovered above his head, a ridiculous thing of horsehair and vanity. Then it tumbled into the dirt. The laughter was worse than the booze. It rolled across the crowd in waves, each peal driving deeper than any bullet he'd ever dodged. Children pointed. Women covered their mouths. Men slapped their knees. Jackson Morrow, The fastest gun in 3 territories, the man who'd supposedly killed 12 men in fair fights. The real number was 3, and only one had been fair, sat exposed on his white horse, bald as an egg, hands shaking like autumn leaves, while 20,000 people laughed at the death of a legend. He didn't remember the ride back to the performer's area. Didn't remember dismounting or handing the reins to the stable boy who couldn't meet his eyes. He walked through the organized chaos of the show's backyard, the rattle of mess kits, the smell of bacon and beans, the shouts in English and German and Lakota, like a ghost passing through a world that no longer had any use for him. His tent sat at the far end of the performer's quarter, befitting his status as a star. Or what had been his status. The buffalo hide walls that had seemed impressive this morning now felt like a mausoleum. He pushed through the entrance flap and collapsed onto his camp chair. The mirror on his traveling trunk showed him what he'd become, a gaunt old man with liver-spotted hands and hollow eyes, wearing a costume that suddenly looked like exactly what it was, a lie. The silver concho buttons on his vest were tarnished. The fringe on his jacket was ratty. Even his boots, the ones with the silver spurs that had cost him a month's wages in '71, looked cheap and theatrical under the lamplight. He reached for the whiskey bottle he kept hidden under his bedroll. His hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get the cork out. He'd just raised it to his lips when a voice spoke from the tent's entrance. "That won't help the shaking. Only make it worse." Jack spun around too fast, whiskey sloshing over his hand, to find a woman standing in his doorway. She was perhaps 40, maybe 50. Age sat differently on Indian faces, with hair the color of a raven's wing braided with strips of red cloth. She wore a simple buckskin dress, but her eyes held something that made Jack lower the bottle. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, trying to summon some dignity. "I am called Wakya W. Thunder Woman, though the showmen call me Mary." She spoke English with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as a weapon of survival. "I am healer for the Lakota riders. I see your hands. I see your shame. And I see that you are dying inside piece by piece. Get out." She didn't move. 3 years ago, a warrior named H. Pei came to me. Brave man. Good father. His hands shook like yours. He thought the spirits had cursed him for leaving the reservation, for dancing in front of white people like a trained dog. She stepped further into the tent, and Jack caught the scent of sage, and something else, sweetgrass maybe. He wanted to die. Said he could not hunt, could not provide, could not be a man anymore. I said, "Get out." His hands are steady now. Not perfect, the earth has turned too many seasons for perfect. But steady enough to hold his granddaughter. Steady enough to braid his wife's hair. Steady enough to remember who he was before the show. Jack stared at her. "You're saying you can fix me with what, some Indian magic, some roots and berries and prayers to the Great Spirit?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, soaked in whiskey-fueled bitterness. Thunder Woman's expression didn't change. "Magic? No. Medicine, yes. The same medicine my grandmother's grandmother used. The same medicine that kept our warriors strong when your people tried to starve us into nothing." She reached into the parfleche bag hanging at her side and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in hide. "Skullcap. American skullcap. My people call it quiet mind plant. It soothes the spirit that makes your hands forget how to be still. A plant. Everything is a plant, white man. The whiskey you drink, plant. The tobacco you smoke, plant. The bread you eat, plant. But some plants heal. Some plants kill. Some plants." She paused, her dark eyes catching the lamplight. "Some plants give men back their pride." Jack wanted to laugh. Wanted to throw her out. But something in her voice, not hope exactly, but something harder, more real than hope, made him hesitate. "Why would you help me? I'm part of this circus that puts your people on display like curiosities." "Because I remember who I was before the reservation. Before the hunger winters. before the agent came and said we could either starve with dignity or eat with shame. She set the bundle on his trunk. I chose shame, but I chose to live. The show pays $3 a week and provides food. On the reservation, we had nothing but promises from men who'd already broken every promise they'd ever made. She turned to leave, then paused at the tent flap. HPA is the third warrior from the front in the buffalo hunt routine. Watch him tomorrow. His hands are not what they were at 20, but they remember enough. Wait, Jack called out. This medicine. How long before it works? 3 days for the tremor to quiet. 3 weeks for your spirit to remember it can be quiet. 3 months to truly heal. Her smile was sad and knowing. But you whites are always in such a hurry, always rushing toward the grave like it might close before you get there. She left him alone with the bundle and his shame. Jack stared at the medicine bundle on his trunk. Pride warred with desperation. Pride whispered that a white Christian man didn't need Indian witch doctoring. Desperation screamed that a man with shaking hands had nothing left to lose. Desperation won. At dawn he unwrapped the dried leaves. Skullcap. Willow bark. The instructions were written in careful script ending, with a line that hit him harder than a bullet. Do not expect miracles, expect only to remember who you were. He brewed the tea. It smelled like wet hay and tasted like defeat. He drank it anyway. That evening, Thunder Woman appeared at his tent with a pot of elk stew. She watched him pour another cup of the bitter tea. You are terrified, she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. I'm not afraid. She laughed, a sound like water over stones. You are. You aren't afraid I will fail. You are afraid I will succeed. Because if I cure you, you must live with the shame that you needed an Indian woman to make you a man again. The truth stung worse than whiskey on an open wound. Tell me, she asked, sitting by his small fire. Why does a man who can no longer shoot stay with a show about shooting? Jack looked at his trembling hands. Where else would I go? I'm 65. My wife left me years ago because I loved my guns more than her. My son died before he could walk. I have no farm, no trade, no family. He laughed bitterly. I'm just a drifter with a talent for putting holes in things. This circus is all I have. Thunder Woman stared into the embers. My husband was killed at Wounded Knee. My daughter starved to death the same winter because the government agents lied about food. Her voice was flat, but heavy with a grief that made Jack's loneliness seem small. I stay with the show because the money feeds my son's family on the reservation. I wear feathers and pretend to be the savage your people want to see, so that my grandchildren might live one more season. Jack fell silent. He realized then that they were the same two ghosts haunting a world that had moved on, performing lies just to survive. Drink, she commanded softly, standing up. Sleep, if you can. Tomorrow your hands will begin to remember. In 3 days you will be ready to learn. Learn what? Jack asked. Thunder Woman looked back from the tent flap, her eyes dark and knowing. How to aim again. But this time, with different eyes. The change was subtle at first. On the second day, Jack noticed he could hold his coffee cup without the liquid sloshing over the rim. On the third day, he managed to button his shirt on the first try, a simple act that had become impossible 3 months ago. The tremor didn't disappear, but it retreated, became something he could work around rather than something that ruled him. Like a bully who'd finally been faced down and decided easier prey existed elsewhere. Thunder Woman came every evening, checking his progress, adjusting the tea's strength, adding in black cohosh when his joints ached from old wounds he'd almost forgotten. She told him stories while she worked, not the simplified tales the show audiences wanted to hear, but real stories. Stories of survival and adaptation. Stories of her grandmother healing warriors after cavalry attacks with nothing but plants and prayers and pure stubborn will. Your people think our medicine is magic, she said one night, grinding herbs in a stone mortar. It is not magic. It is knowledge. Knowledge older than your Bible. We know which bark stops pain because the earth showed us. We know which roots calm the spirit because we listened when others ignored. The earth showed you. She gave him a look that might have been pity. You think knowledge only comes from books from universities? The earth is the oldest teacher. She kills the plants that poison, rewards the plants that heal. For 10,000 years my people watched and learned. Then your people came and called us ignorant savages. She smiled without humor. Yet here you sit healed by savage ignorance. Jack had no answer for that. On the fourth day, Thunder Woman brought him to the shooting range during the morning practice before the audiences arrived. The other performers, cowboys, vaqueros, Cossack riders, Bedouin horsemen, stopped to watch. Word had spread about Jack's collapse. Some looked sympathetic. Most just looked curious to see if the legend could resurrect itself. P.H. was there, the Lakota warrior Thunder Woman had mentioned. He was perhaps 50, lean and weathered with braids threaded with leather strips. When Jack approached, he nodded with the grave courtesy that seemed natural to him. Thunder Woman says you wish to learn the old way of shooting, P.H. said in careful English. I wish to shoot any way that doesn't make me look like a fool. The warrior's smile was unexpected, transforming his stern face. Good. White men often come wanting to learn Indian secrets. They want magic arrows or spirit bullets. There are no secrets. Only practice. Only patience. Only. He held up his right hand, which had a barely visible tremor, only learning to shoot with the body you have, not the body you wish you had. For the next 2 hours P.H. taught Jack something that felt completely backward, how to shoot without the careful aim he'd spent 40 years perfecting. You shoot with your eyes, the warrior explained. You aim and think and calculate. Good for targets standing still. Bad for targets moving. Bad for hands that shake. Your mind says, be steady, but your hands do not listen. So we teach your body to shoot without your mind. It was called point shooting, instinctive shooting, and it required everything Jack had been trained not to do. Instead of carefully lining up the sights, he was supposed to simply look at the target and let his body orient the gun naturally, the way you'd point your finger at something. Your mind is your enemy, P.H. said. When you think, your hands remember, they shake. When you do not think, when you let the body remember its own wisdom, the shake matters less. It sounded like mystical nonsense. But then again, so had drinking plant tea, and that had worked. They practiced with unloaded guns first, just the movement. Point and shoot. Point and shoot. No aiming. No thinking. Just let the body remember patterns older than thought. By the end of the first week, Jack could hit targets at 15 feet about half the time. Not good by his old standards, but better than he'd managed in months. By the end of the second week, Thunder Woman declared him ready for the next phase. Now, she said, you must learn to perform again. Not as you did before that man is gone, but as you are now. Older. Different. Still worthy of the name they gave you. The ringmaster folded his arms, looking at Jack like he was a bad investment. You want back in, Jack? The crowd laughed at you. Do you know what that does to ticket sales? Give me one night, Jack said, his voice low but steady. One performance. If I fail, you'll never see me again. But if I succeed, you get your legend back. Financial calculation warred with curiosity in the ringmaster's eyes. Finally he nodded. One night, but nothing fancy. No horses. Just something you can actually do. Just something I can actually do. The night of his return, Jack stood behind the heavy velvet curtain. The crowd was smaller. Word of his failure had spread, but 5,000 people still waited. They were there for one of two things, a resurrection or a funeral. Thunder Woman appeared beside him. She pressed a small leather pouch into his palm. For luck. What is this protection? Courage. It does nothing and it does everything. She tied it around his neck, tucking it under his shirt. The medicine is not in the bag, Jackson. The medicine is in believing the bag helps. Jack touched the worn leather. It felt like the skullcap tee, like the point-shooting lessons, half practical, half belief. Why, he asked. Why help a washed-up old man? Because you reminded me of my husband, she said, her dark eyes reflecting the lantern light. Too proud to ask for help, too alive to give up. Better you stand up. Better you remember that defeat is not the end unless you decide it is. Then she was gone. The announcer's voice boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who stared down death itself, Jackson's steady hand borrow." Jack walked into the arena. No horse. No wig. Just him, his guns, and the truth. The applause was polite, skeptical. He could feel their doubt, like a physical weight. "Folks," Jack said, his voice cutting through the silence, "I'm not going to lie to you. You saw me fail. You saw me shake." He held up his right hand, letting the spotlight catch the visible tremor. "I'm 65 years old. My body doesn't work like it used to. So, tonight I won't pretend I'm 25. I'm going to show you what an old man can do when he stops fighting the truth." The crowd leaned forward. Honesty was a showmanship they hadn't expected. First up, glass bottles at 20 feet. Jack drew. He didn't squint down the sights. He didn't calculate wind speed. He just looked and fired, point shooting, trusting muscle memory older than his conscious thought. Bang! 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 6 bottles shattered in rapid succession. The crowd blinked, surprised. Scattered applause broke out. Next, the mirror shot. His signature trick. It required stillness he no longer possessed. But Pa's voice echoed in his mind, "The shake is small. The mirror is forgiving. Don't think about the hand. Think about the bullet." Jack turned his back to the target. Shotgun on his shoulder. Mirror in his left hand. He inhaled the smell of sawdust and gunpowder. He let the body remember. He fired. The target exploded into dust. The crowd roared. For 40 minutes Jack Morrow didn't perform. He fought. He fought his age, his nerves, and his past. He missed 2 shots, but he didn't panic. He simply reloaded and fired again. The crowd watched, mesmerized. They weren't seeing a god anymore. They were seeing a man refusing to break. "For my final shot," Jack called out, sweat stinging his eyes, "I will attempt the impossible." Attendants tossed glass orbs filled with colored powder into the air. Jack walked forward, gun at his hip, eyes wide open. 20 years ago, I did this at a gallop. Today, by God, I'll do it on my own 2 feet. First orb. Blue. Bang, a cloud of azure smoke. Second orb. Red. Bang, crimson rain. The crowd was on its feet now. Yellow. Green. Purple. He fired in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Bang, bang, bang. The orbs burst in rapid succession, creating rainbow ghosts that drifted down under the arena lights. Jack lowered his gun. His hand was shaking violently now from the exertion. He looked up. They weren't just clapping. They were screaming. Old men with their own trembling hands were weeping. Young men were cheering with respect. "I ain't what I was," Jack whispered into the thunderous noise. "But I'm still here." He took his bow, his bald head shining under the lights. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in a show built on lies, reality was the rarest act of all. Backstage, the ringmaster was practically vibrating. "Jack, that was incredible. The aging gunfighter angle. We can sell that, will make a fortune." "No," Jack said quietly, holstering his pistols for the last time. "What I said, no. That was it. My last performance." "Are you insane? You're a star again." "I didn't do it for you. And I didn't do it for the money. I did it to prove to myself that I could." He looked at the chaos of the show, the world that had been his home for 15 years. It's time I figure out what comes next. He found Thunder Woman in the medical tent. She didn't look up from the bandage she was wrapping, but a small smile touched her lips. So she said, "You leave, I think so. Maybe California." Jack hesitated, feeling like a schoolboy. You could come. We could both get out of this life." Thunder Woman paused. For a second, the silence hung heavy between them. Then she laughed, that soft sound like water over stones. "Foolish white man, you 3 weeks of tea and shooting lessons makes us partners." Her eyes were kind, taking the sting out of the rejection. "My place is here. My people need the money I send home. The warriors need my medicine to keep dancing. I just thought. It was a good thought. But go. Find your peace." Jack nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Can I at least pay you for the lessons for saving me?" Thunder Woman stood up and placed a hand on his chest right over the medicine bag. "No," she said firmly. "You pay me by living. By not giving up. By showing other old men that age is not the end. That is payment enough." Jack stood there for a long moment, wanting to say something profound. But there were no words for this. He simply touched the leather bag under his shirt, turned, and walked out into the night. He was leaving the show, but for the first time in years he wasn't running away. Jack was packing his tent on the morning of October 29, 1888, when the world ended. It started with a sound like thunder, deep, grinding, metallic. Then screams. Then silence worse than screams. He ran toward the railroad siding where the show's second train had been scheduled to arrive. Other performers were running too, all converging on a sight that would haunt every one of them until their dying days. 2 trains had collided head-on with the force of 2 mountains meeting. The freight train running the wrong direction on the single track, due to miscommunication between station masters, had plowed into the show train carrying the performers' equipment and horses. The impact had been so violent that the locomotives had accordioned together like paper, and the wooden cars behind them had splintered like matchsticks. Steam from ruptured boilers mixed with smoke from fires already starting in the wreckage. The smell of coal and hot metal and blood filled the morning air. But it was the sound that Jack would remember forever, the screaming of the horses. Over 100 horses had been in those forward cars, traveling in specially designed stock cars, with padding and ventilation, the show's most precious assets. Now they were trapped in a nightmare of splintered wood and twisted iron. Some had died instantly in the collision, their necks broken, their bodies crushed. Others were trapped legs, shattered, crying out in pain and terror. Still others had escaped the immediate wreckage, only to stand in shock nearby, blood streaming from cuts, ribs visible through torn hide. The war ponies of the Lakota warriors. The white stallions of the Cossack riders. The trick horses that could dance and count and bow on command. The bucking broncos. The gentle plow horses that pulled the equipment wagons. All of them bleeding into the morning light. The ringmaster reached the scene and simply collapsed to his knees in the mud and blood. Jack saw tears streaming down the man's face as he surveyed the destruction. These weren't just horses, they were the show's stars. They were investments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were companions. They were in many ways more famous than the human performers who rode them. Pei stood nearby, his face like stone, watching as workers tried to free his personal mount, a paint horse named Stormwalker that had carried him through countless performances. The horse was trapped under a fallen timber, one leg bent at an impossible angle. It saw its rider and tried to stand, failing, screaming its confusion and pain. "Get the guns," someone said. The voice was flat, empty. "We have to end it." Jack found himself with a pistol in his hand, his right hand still tremoring slightly but steady enough for mercy, moving through the wreckage with a dozen other men. Cowboys. Vaqueros, German horsemen, Bedouin riders, men from different continents who'd spent months competing and arguing and mocking each other's riding styles, now united in this one grim duty. The job was simple and horrible: find the horses that couldn't be saved and give them peace. A young Mexican rider named Alejandro, couldn't have been more than 20, was openly weeping as he shot his own mount, a dun mare that had been with him since childhood. An old Cossack with a beard like a white waterfall had to be physically restrained from trying to dig his horse out with his bare hands, even though anyone could see the animal's back was broken. Jack came across the white stallion he'd ridden in performances, the one that had worn paint in his last show, trapped under a beam, both front legs shattered. The horse recognized him. Its eyes were wide with pain and confusion, asking why its human wouldn't help it stand up. Why the person who'd always brought sugar lumps and kind words was just standing there. Jack's hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the gun. The skullcap T was back at camp. His medicine bag was buried under his shirt. Thunder Woman's lessons about letting the body remember seemed obscenely irrelevant in the face of this suffering. He took a shaky breath, placed the barrel against the white blaze on the horse's forehead, that distinctive mark that had made the stallion recognizable even from the cheap seats, and fired. By mid-morning, 110 horses were dead. The air smelled of blood and gun smoke and shattered dreams. Men sat in the mud covered in gore, staring at nothing. Some vomited. Some prayed. Some just sat in silence, holding pieces of torn harness or broken bridle, as if these fragments could somehow resurrect what was lost. The show's finances were destroyed in an instant. Insurance would cover some of the loss, but not enough. Not nearly enough. The ringmaster would have to borrow massive amounts just to clear the wreckage and buy replacement animals. Within 6 months, he'd lost control of the exhibition to his creditors. Within a year, it was just another Wild West show, among many the magic gone, the mythology replaced by pure commercial calculation. The intimate family of performers scattered to other shows, other jobs, other lives. Jack stood in the wreckage of the train cars, looking at the splintered wood and twisted steel, and understood that he was witnessing the end of something bigger than one man's career or one show's fortunes. He was watching the death of an entire era. The collision was almost too perfect a metaphor, the old ways of the West, personal individual based on skill and horses, and human scale literally crushed by the industrial age of railroads and steam, and mechanical indifference. The frontier myth had collided with modern reality, and reality had won the way it always did, brutally, completely, without mercy or romance. The show had tried to preserve something, maybe a lie, maybe a dream, maybe just a memory of freedom that had never quite existed the way people remembered it. But you couldn't preserve the past. You could only package it, sell it, watch it die slowly from the inside. Or, as in this case, watch it die violently in a single morning. He found Thunder Woman among the injured later that day, tending to burns and broken bones with her herbs and endless patience. A young warrior sat before her, his arm clearly broken, crying silent tears. Not from pain, warriors could endure pain, but from grief. His favorite horse, a bay mare he'd raised from a foal back on the reservation, had died in the crash. There was nothing you could do, Thunder Woman told him in Lakota, her voice low and steady. Jack understood enough of the language now to follow her words. The spirits called your horse home. You must let her go. I should have been on the train, the warrior said. I should have died with her. You live because you are meant to live. Because your children need you. Because there is still work to be done. She set the bone with practiced efficiency while the warrior gritted his teeth. The show will survive or it will die. Either way, you will go on. That is what we do. We survive what cannot be changed. We adapt to what cannot be fought. We remember what cannot be preserved. Jack waited until she'd finished bandaging the arm before approaching. I'm leaving today, he told her. not waiting around to watch the show die slowly. She nodded as if she'd expected as much. Where will you go? I don't know. Somewhere the past isn't packaged and sold. Somewhere I can be old and useless in peace. He laughed bitterly. Maybe I'll open a shooting school for old men with shaky hands. Teach them Thunder Woman's wisdom. It is not my wisdom. It is the Earth's wisdom. I only listened. She wiped her hands on a cloth, leaving red-brown stains. You will be all right, Jackson Morrow. You learned the hardest lesson, how to fall and stand again. Did I thaw because right now I just want to find a bottle and disappear into it? Yes, Sess. But you will not. Because you know now that the bottle is not an answer, only a delay. You know now that healing comes from bitter tea and practice, and accepting what you cannot change. She touched his arm, brief, formal, but warm nonetheless. Go. Live. Teach others what you learned. That is how medicine spreads, one person helping another, each in turn. I don't even know what I learned. How to shoot with shaky hands, how to accept being old. You learned that strength is not what you can do at your best. Strength is what you can do at your worst. She smiled, sad and knowing. You learned that legends die, but men can survive if they stop trying to be legends. That is worth teaching. Jack left that afternoon before the cleanup was finished, before the full scope of the disaster became clear. He couldn't bear to watch the slow death of the dream. He didn't go west to California. Instead, he drifted north and east through small towns and smaller lives, carrying his medicine bag and his lessons and his memories of Thunder Woman's healing hands. Sometimes he stopped long enough to teach a young man how to shoot. Sometimes he told stories about the old days, though he was careful now to separate myth from reality, legend from truth. And sometimes, on bad days when his hands shook worst, he would make himself a bitter cup of skullcap tea and remember that healing was possible, even when victory wasn't. That you could lose everything you thought mattered and still find reasons to get up in the morning. Years later, 5-10 time blurred in the way it does for old men, he heard that the show had finally closed for good. That the ringmaster had sold everything at auction and died broke and forgotten. That the Lakota performers had gone back to the reservations, trading brief freedom for permanent survival. He never knew what became of Thunder Woman. He liked to imagine she'd gone home, held her grandchildren, taught them the old plant wisdom before it was lost. But he suspected the truth was grimmer, that she'd stayed with the show until the end, sending money home, until there was no money to send, dying in some anonymous city far from the earth she'd learned from. That was how it worked in the end. The West that everyone wanted to remember, the West of heroes and legends and simple truths, had never really existed. It was always just people trying to survive, doing what they had to do, healing what could be healed and enduring what couldn't. Jack died in 1897, in a boarding house in St. Louis, of pneumonia. He was 74 years old. His obituary mentioned he'd once been a sharpshooter in a Wild West show, but got most of the details wrong. It spelled his name wrong. It claimed he'd killed 16 men in gunfights, which would have made him laugh and cry in equal measure. They found his few possessions in a single trunk: some clothes, a pair of fancy boots with tarnished spurs, a set of pistols he hadn't fired in years, and a small leather medicine bag on a worn cord. The boarding house owner, not knowing what it was, threw the medicine bag away. But for 9 years, Jackson's steady hand Morrow had worn it against his heart, a reminder that strength came in unexpected forms, that wisdom could be found in bitter tea and point shooting and accepting help from those you'd been taught to dismiss. That healing was possible even for old men with shaking hands and broken pride. That legends died, but men, real flawed ordinary men, could choose to keep living. The glass orb had exploded into crimson feathers 40 feet from where it should have. But in the end, Jackson Morrow had learned that missing the target wasn't the same as missing the point. He had learned finally how to aim at truth instead of glory. And that in its way was the steadiest hand of all. The Wild West show era ended not with applause, but with the grinding collision of locomotives mythology crushed beneath the wheels of industry. The performers scattered to reservations and retirement homes and unmarked graves. The horses were replaced with automobiles. The exhibition grounds became parking lots. But somewhere in the dust and wreckage, a few real lessons survived. That dignity could be found in acceptance, that wisdom came from unexpected sources, and that the most important shots were the ones you took after you'd already missed. Those lessons, like good medicine, spread slowly, one person to another, each in turn. Bitter tea and steady hands. That was the real show. The one nobody paid to see. The one that mattered most.